So the world of whisky, it can seem quite difficult to get into. There's a lot of hugely passionate people batting about quite a lot of complex terms, and I know that I've probably come across as quite pretentious when talking about whisky, even though I haven't meant to. But I thought today, why not try and make a wee video, demystify some whisky terms, try and make it that wee bit easier to get involved in the industry. Now, disclaimer, I'm no whisky expert with hundreds of credentials to my name. I'm just going to be sharing some of the things that I've picked up working in the industry in the last 3.5 years. And if you do want to know a little bit more, I'd highly recommend checking out the Scotch whisky experience in Edinburgh. That's where I work, that's where I learned a lot of these things that I'll be telling you about today. And right now we're actually running online tastings. So we send you some miniatures, we send you some chocolates, we take you through a personalised tasting over Zoom, give you a bit of history, give you a bit of information about what you're drinking. I'll leave a link to that if you're interested in the description of this video. And do also subscribe to this channel as well. So I've got some video ideas in the pipeline, whisky history, hopefully some travel vlogs, visiting distilleries in summer. Stay tuned for that, it's going to be good. Now, the first word I wanted to talk about today was cask. And immediately, straight off the bat, I'm going to sound pretentious. This is a real pet peeve of mine. Whisky matures in casks. A barrel is a type of cask. So all barrels are casks, but not all casks are barrels. So the word barrel, that refers to bourbon barrels, and that's what the Americans use to mature their whisky. And a lot of old bourbon barrels, they do make their way over to Scotland. We do use them in our industry. We also might use ex-sherry casks, we might use old red wine casks, we might use tequila casks if we're feeling adventurous. So when you're talking about Scotch maturation in future, you're not necessarily wrong to say that it matures in a barrel, a lot of whisky does, but you're more right to say that whisky matures in a cask. So you'll use your casks to mature single malt. And single malt, it's the term batted about a huge amount when you're talking about whisky. But I'd probably been working in the industry for about 2 years before I knew what the term actually meant. So malt, that refers to the malted barley. That's what you're producing your single malt whisky from. So you're steeping the barley in water, you're allowing it to germinate, and then you're heating it. And this is effectively tricking the barley into thinking it's spring. So your barley is busy breaking down all its starches into sugars. And we're going to extract these sugars in the mashing process using hot water. This produces a wort. And this wort, this sugary water, that's what you're adding the yeast to in the fermentation process to produce the alcohol. So that covers the malt. But what does the single mean in single malt whisky? Just refers to the fact that all the whisky in the bottle was produced by one distillery. So if we, take this bottle of Glenallachie, within this bottle you might have some bourbon barrel matured whisky, some sherry cask whisky, you might have some 12-year-old, some 15-year-old, but to call it single malt, everything in the bottle had to be produced by Glenallachie. And that kind of brings us on to talking about the age statement on the bottle of whisky. So when you pick yourself up a bottle of 10, a bottle of 12, the age on the bottle, that's the youngest whisky that's gone into the bottle. So again, if we look at our Glenallachie, this is a 12-year-old, but you might have some 15-year-old whisky, you might have some 18-year-old whisky if you're lucky going into the bottle, but the youngest whisky that was used to produce this expression was 12 years old. Now distilleries, they don't have to put the age of the youngest whisky on the bottle. This Bunnahabhain, for example, doesn't have an age on it. And we call whiskies like this non-age statement, but don't think you're getting a worse product just because you don't see a number on the bottle. So there's a bit of a misconception that older whisky is immediately better whisky, and this really isn't true. So yes, your older whisky, it's spent longer in the cask, it's had more time to draw flavour from the wood, but better, it's all a matter of personal opinion. Like, I've probably tried hundreds of whiskies, but one bottle that I always come back to, it's the non-age statement Glenkeith, and you can pick that up for like 20 quid out of the supermarket. So don't feel like you've got to drop hundreds of pounds in some 30-year-old bottle of whiskey to get something good. There are some excellent affordable whiskies out there. And if you do want to know some of my personal favourite whiskies at different price ranges, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be making a video about exactly that in future. Now, another type of whisky people have a lot of misconceptions about is blended whisky. So your blended whisky, it's produced using single malts that we've already spoke about, and it's mixed with grain whisky. And I do plan on making a whole video in future just talking about grain whisky, but as a wee kind of Cliff Notes version, your grain whisky is made using a mix of cereals like your barleys, your wheats, your corns, and it's distilled in these huge tall towers called coffee stills. Now, it's typically a lot faster and a lot cheaper to produce your grain whisky in comparison comparison to single malts. And this can make your blended whisky that wee bit cheaper to buy, but don't think you're getting an inferior product just because you're spending less. The skill, the art that goes into blending, it's unbelievable. I think Johnnie Walker Red Label's got something like 40 different constituent parts, so mixing these together in the right quantities, getting the flavour you want, it's a hugely impressive skill. I've got a lot of appreciation for the master blenders who produce these blended whiskies, and of course for blended whiskies themselves. There's some incredible blends out there. So we're going to move into something maybe a wee bit more technical now, and that's chill filtration. So a lot of distilleries, a lot of companies, they like to put unchill filtered on their bottle. Signatory, an independent bottler, and they also own Ed the Dower, they've got a whole unchill filtered collection. But what actually is chill filtration? So it's essentially a way of purifying your whiskey. So floating them out in a bottle, you're going to have oils, you're going to have esters, you're going to have other chemical compounds that are going to give you flavour, and they're going to give you quite a viscous mouthfeel. Now when you cool down your whiskey, these chemical compounds, they tend to clump together. And this can make your whiskey look a wee bit cloudy, maybe a wee bit unappealing for some people. So chill filtration, it's essentially a way of making sure this cloudiness doesn't occur. So before the whiskey's bottled, it's going to be cooled to something like 4 degrees, and it's going to get passed through a fine mesh. And this mesh, it's going to catch all those clumped oils and esters. So this means when you add some ice to your glass, you're not going to see any cloudiness. Now, whiskey geeks, we've usually got some quite strong opinions on chill filtration. We usually want to drink whiskey how God intended it, but I was at a tasting the other day, and somebody raised quite a good point that you never get to try a whiskey before and after chill filtration, so you don't really know how it affects the character or the flavour of your dram. But personally, I quite enjoy a viscous mouthfeel, I quite enjoy an oily dram, so I'm not a great fan of chill filtration, but you might completely disagree with my opinion. That's just personal preference. Both our opinions are just as valid. So moving away from the slightly more technical side of things, something that I get asked at work a lot is about the word dram. What's a dram? And you've probably already heard me mention it a couple of times in this video. Now, a dram is just however much whiskey ends up in the glass. So if you go to the pub in Scotland, your dram will be 25 mils. You might be lucky, you might go somewhere that serves quarter gills. It's an old-timey measurement, it's a wee bit more. If it's before bed, you're just having a wee nightcap, the dram might just be a dribble in the bottom of the glass. You can also use the word as a verb, you can go out dramming, but in essence, a dram, it's just an unspecified volume of whiskey. Now another word that I get asked about a lot at work is Glen. And the word comes from Goidelic, which is an old Celtic language that would have given rise to Irish Gaelic and Scots Gaelic. And Glen, it just means valley. So if you're building a distillery, you need a good source of water, you're going to be building in the bottom of a glen where the river runs through. Or maybe if you're building a distillery illegally, like a lot of people did in the late 18th and early 19th century, a glen is going to be quite a good place to hide your operation. So for these reasons, a lot of your big name distilleries, your Glenfiddichs, your Glenlivets, they've all got Glen in their name. Now another interestingly named whiskey is Monkey's Shoulder, and this was very heavily marketed. If you were about the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2019, you might have seen they had this 4-metre tall cocktail mixer truck in George Square promoting Monkey's Shoulder. And if my memory serves me right, I think there might have been a silent disco that went along with it, but as an Edinburgh local during the Fringe, you must hate silent discos with every fibre of your being, so there was no way that was going to get involved in that. The Monkey's Shoulder actually takes its name from quite an interesting condition that a lot of distillery workers would have suffered with in the past. So earlier we spoke about the malting process, where you're steeping the barley in water, you're allowing it to germinate, and then you're heating it to dry it. And these days the drying process is basically conducted in a big drum and you blow hot air onto it. But in the past, you had to spread the barley over a malting floor, and then you'd employed maltmen and flat caps to come and shovel at the barley and keep it moving. But problem with this, if you're spending all day shoveling, you're going to start developing strain injuries. And the maltmen, their arms used to start hanging down a little bit like a monkey's would. Now these days, very few distilleries still do their own floor malting. I think it's only something like 7 out of 130 that still turn malt by hand. So Monkey's Shoulder, it's not really a problem anymore. But the blended malt, it gives a wee nod to those hard-working men and women who would have sacrificed their arms so we could drink whiskey. Now the last word I'm going to talk about, it's something that maybe even whiskey nerds might not have heard of, and it's a roozer. So roozers, they really aren't used a lot anymore. There's only one distillery, Glenturret, that I know of that still uses them. But a roozer, it's basically a big stick, and it's how you hand operate a mash tun. So your mash tun is effectively a big vat, and it's where you add your ground up malted barley, called grist, and you add your hot water to strip the sugar from this grist. And you've basically got sort of mechanical ploughs that move around and they mix the grist and the water together. But at Glenturret, and at all distilleries I suppose back in the day, you'd have just employed someone to kind of poke about at the barley with the rooser. And it's really fascinating to see the rooser being used. I'd highly recommend a trip to Glenturret just to see it. It's a piece of whisky history that's probably soon going to be lost. But on that note, I'm going to leave this one here. If you do want to know more and you do want to have some cracking drams while you're at it, again, I'd highly recommend a tasting, a virtual tasting at the Scotch Whisky Experience. There'll be a link for that in the description. Or come in and visit us once we're back up and running for a tour. And do subscribe to my channel as well. Plenty more whisky stories, history, maybe some travel vlogs and summer visiting distilleries. Plenty to look forward to. Hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good one.